Welcome to the Samuel Associates LinkedIn Live webinar for Canadian and U.S. tech industry executives. Land acknowledgement. Samuel Associates is headquartered here in Ottawa, Canada, and I'd like to take this opportunity to provide a traditional land acknowledgement before we begin our session today. Our office, located on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe-Algonquin Nation. We acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land of Canada on which we live, work, and honor our ongoing historical relationships, past, present, and future, with all Indigenous peoples. Thank you for participating in today's live session. Next month will mark a new parliamentary session here in Ottawa. The business of government will be in full swing right after Labor Day. Many of the high-tech companies that we work with and interact are wondering, how does government relations fit into the overall strategic marketing and business development plans? Particularly, as often may be the case, how do you maximize your access to the government marketplace in a positive and meaningful way? We've designed today's webinar to answer one simple question: why does government relations matter today? And perhaps I can add, why does government relations matter to your tech company? I'm Goran Samuel Pesek, founder and CEO of Samuel Associates. Samuel Associates is Canada's leading strategic consulting and government relations firm. We provide advice to top Canadian and U.S. tech companies on government procurement opportunities and translate government speak into business speak and vice versa. With me today from Samuel Associates team to explore this subject are the Honorable James Bailey, Managing Director for Atlantic Canada, and our Senior Strategy and Technology Associate, Dave McMahon. Jamie is coming from us from Halifax this morning, and Dave is near here to Ottawa, just outside of the Ottawa area. The government announces new projects and initiatives aimed at the tech sector on a regular basis. This could come from the federal budget, the speech from the throne, mandate letters to ministers, summit communiques, and simple press releases. The government is actively engaged with industry, but it can be hard to fully navigate government procurement process. That's where our firm steps in to help tech companies build relationships with government departments and agencies that actually require their services and solutions. To help frame our discussion today, we're going to put the top 5 questions we get most frequently asked by tech sector clients and the broader technology sector industry. Our goal is to provide you with the strategies, tips, and answers you need to better understand why government relations matters to your company. Afterwards, we'll shift to the Q&A section, and I invite you to submit your questions through the comments section on the LinkedIn live stream page. Feel free to submit those questions throughout our session, and we'll get back to you in the second half of this webinar. Now, answering the first question, I think, is probably the most important place to start. And I'm going to just simply ask either Jamie or Dave, feel free to jump in and try to answer this one, because I think it's the most fundamental question. What is government relations, and how does it complement business development efforts for tech companies?
Well, I'm happy to jump in, Goran, and hello, everyone, and hello to my colleague, Dave. It's great to be with you today. I will start by saying that in addition to my responsibilities with Samuel Associates, I am actually the executive chair of a tech company called Fundmetric here in Halifax. You can look it up later, but Fundmetric uses the power of machine learning to help large educational institutions maximize their annual giving campaigns and other giving campaigns from our universities, both in Canada and in the United States. It's a pretty cool company. We've gone through the founder stage, a Series A round. We do some work with governments both here and in the States. So I kind of have 2 hats on as I talk to you today about this very important question: what is government relations? I know we get that question all the time. I would just say, simply, the word relations, whether it's government or anything else, therein lies the answer. If you want to have a relationship with another person or another organization. What does that mean? Well, it means the same thing. It means you want to know their strengths and weaknesses. You want to know what their objectives are. You want to get to know them and where they want to go. With government, that's also true. It's as simple as that. You have an advantage with government because they'll actually tell you, at least in our Western democracies, they're fairly open. Political parties that win elections have platforms. Government departments publish online annual business plans, and budgets, of course, are very important ways of determining what a government wants to accomplish. Goran mentioned that ministers get mandate letters from the prime minister. They're all available to the general public to see. It's a lot of volume. That's why people like us exist, to help wade through all that. But governments are fairly open about what they want to accomplish. And
Let
then
me
if
ask you,
you,
Jamie,
yeah,
just on the other side of the coin here, how does the government relations complement business development efforts by tech companies? Because sometimes the two are sometimes put into one, but I think in our industry, we tend to separate them as one side of the coin and the other.
yeah, well, it's a much more indirect approach. So where I'm headed with all this is when you have an understanding of what your government, whether it's the federal government or a provincial or state government, once you have a good sense of where they are trying to take your state or your province or your country, your job when you're building a relationship with them is to show how your product or service fits in with the government's objective. It's not a cold call. This is not a cold call business. This is a highly sophisticated, highly intuitive, long-term sales cycle with government. So I'll give you an example. The federal government of Canada has a digital strategy. I don't know how many of you have read it, but if you're in the tech industry, you should know it.
Is
They're
located
trying to
session
digitize
in Ottawa.
across all departments of government. They have a northern framework where they're looking to provide services and goods to northern Canada in new ways. There's opportunities in defense. NATO, as another example, we're part of the NATO alliance. NATO has identified 7 technology disruptors that are going to be the future of defense and security and warfare. You ought to know what those are. To me, government relations, like any other kind of relations, is understanding your counterparty, where they want to go, and showing them how what you do helps them achieve their objectives.
Great. Well, Jamie, thank you. That's a very comprehensive answer. And I'm happy that you're bringing both your hats today, one as a professional in this field, but also on a tech company board, because I think it's important that the audience know that we're also practitioners in the space as well. So thank you for telling us about that. I'll bring in Dave McMahon to sort of look at this particular question from his technical perspective. Dave has tremendous experience and many decades working with technology companies, different government agencies and departments. So Dave, let me ask you this simple question again. What is government relations and how does it complement business development efforts for tech companies?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I mean, so half my career was sort of spent on the government side, having people try to sell me stuff, and then I'm now on this side in terms of helping companies work with government. So if I can give sort of two perspectives and back to the original question in terms of what's sort of different, and I think if I summarize, there's sort of 10 things that where government relations can help in terms of selling to government or developing a relationship with government.
Yeah, Dave, let me just ask you in terms of, again, that complementariness of government relations and how it sort of is the flip side of the coin. I mean, business development obviously takes a lot of time in order to present the company's offering, their solution, obviously their credentials, and many other things. And so the government ultimately is a very long market. However, once you're in that market or in that ecosystem, you could essentially ride, I guess, the commercial economic downturn, and it could perhaps save your company as well. So I just wanted to kind of just get your thoughts about the fact that, when we say business development and government relations, this is the long game in terms of profitability, reputation, et cetera. What is your experience with that in supporting clients?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, probably leading with government relations, it's all really about building trust, not going in for the hard sell right away. Because you go in with a hard sell, you got one chance maybe to hit on something. You may get something, you may get a short-term success. But in terms of long-term success and being able to part of the decision-making process of the government and be actually seen as a partner, it helps to go in a little bit more softly and with in fact a trusted third party at your side, to sort of ease into that relationship and then maintain it through the long term.
Excellent. And actually that, Dave, I'll sort of ask you to pick up on question number 2 here, because I think question number 2 is somewhat very important again when we're looking at timing and expectations. So the second question is really, how does government relations differ from transaction-based sales cycles for tech companies? So basically, the sales cycle is very different. It's not transactional. There's a trusted factor here that you mentioned. Can you just a little bit elaborate on that? And I'll turn to Jamie to get his perspectives on that.
Yeah, I mean, transactional based accounts that's a commodity based market, price sensitive. So with no real intrinsic relationship between the buyer and the seller. It's lowest price compliant, and you'll lose based just on price. And it's very, very fickle environment. You may have, short-term success, but not really, it's not going to pan out in the long term. For long-term success, especially with major crown projects, requires developing a long-term relationship based on more than a transactional amount and the price point.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I'll turn to Jamie. Jamie, just what's your thinking about that particular statement on question 2?
Well, I think it's such a great point about trust. You almost never make a sale to any government entity in one meeting. That just doesn't happen. Power in our government system is too diffuse. The decision makers are multi-layered and broad across multiple departments. You need to have a trusting relationship with your counterparties in government. Multiple counterparties before you're going to enter into the sales process. Basically, in government, unlike a business, everyone is held accountable in multiple ways by others. Whether, so say it's a Department of Defense, they still have to answer to the Privy Council office, the Auditor General, the Prime Minister's office, the PSPC, and they're only going to be comfortable making purchase decisions when they have a trusting relationship with you that they can then communicate both to their superiors and to the people responsible for holding them accountable. Even further up the chain, to the opposition and ultimately to the taxpayers of Canada. All of that has to be justified in everything the government does. That sounds daunting. It just means that the sales process and the trust building process is a big upfront investment. And then once you're through that, you obviously have access to a very, very big and lifelong and recession-proof customer.
Yeah, well, Jamie, you hit something right there. I think question 3, actually, I think you really set it up well, because question 3 really talks about how important are company reputation and brand management when it comes to dealing with the government.
Yeah, well, that's the biggest thing you're building, both in the general marketplace and in the government marketplace, which is somewhat different from the general marketplace. That comes, I think Dave touched on this, and this is so important. Your objective in your first meeting is not a sale. It is to build a relationship. The worst thing you can do is show up when you're anxious to sell the government something. More than any other customer, you need to have meetings just to build awareness. First of all, you need to be discoverable by the government when they need something. If you've done your GR homework in advance, when the government has an urgent need, they will come to you, and then you're in the driver's seat around the terms of any transaction you make. But that is all that you're doing when you are starting out, is building up the credibility and the go-to person status that is required when government decisions get made. And I will say that COVID proved this, because all of a sudden, when COVID started, government needed to buy a lot of stuff in a hurry. And those companies, particularly suppliers of PPE, and other COVID emergency funds, those that had built those relationships over years in advance suddenly got phone calls and sales orders beyond their wildest dreams. And that just shows that you have to do the upfront work if you want to be a supplier to government for the long term.
Yeah, that's a very good point you raised, Jamie. During COVID, I think it was important that companies who were really, I guess, high reputation, good brand, the government did turn to them for whether it's hardware, software, other types of solutions, and ask them to scale up even because of the work from home requirements and other things that the government now had to really pivot on very quickly. So I think that certainly having those conditions in advance, the government, as you said, can turn to companies and say, "What else can you do? I need additional capabilities." I'm going to ask Dave, because I know, Dave, this is something that you deal with this when we are dealing with our clients about the notion of simply company reputation, getting the brand right, but it's not just the brand, but it's what it represents. Can you touch upon that from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was what Jamie was saying around reputation and an independent verification or validation of who you are and what you're selling, and let's say your technology. The government is not going to bring in some novel technology by three gentlemen and a couple ladies in a business, a small business, and put it into their infrastructure unless they have a great deal of trust in the terms of the company, the viability of the company, the technology being sold. But what likely they're probably more likely to do is go with someone that they've been working with for a while, that they trust, that is solvent. They understand the company's going to be around for a while. They understand the players. If they really want the technology, they may ask the company to buy it for them and trial it for them, and then take the risk associated with it. But very rare. In fact, when I was with Bell Canada, we wouldn't put anything to the core. If someone just showed up with a brilliant technology on our doorstep and they're a small company, it'd have to be a pretty brilliant technology. And then we would have to do all the necessary testing and everything before go into the core or large system. So you have to be cognizant of that, especially you're selling something as new that's unknown. You're going to have to actually be known before you sell it to anyone the size of the government or a large enterprise like that. And so that sort of relationship building is something that's important, that goes in advance of business development, as Jamie was saying.
Excellent. Well, Dave, I'm gonna hold you to some other concept here that really touches on what you just said in the last few seconds, and that is, I mean, government. Question 4 that we have here. I mean, government operates in the public interest, right? And companies operate in the private interest. What strategies can you use to determine where the public and the private sector interests overlap?
Well, there's quite a bit now, especially in cyberspace. So, I mean, one interesting thing occurs around high tech and cyberspace is that most of cyberspace is owned and operated by the private sector, and critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector. So, if you look at the government and large critical infrastructures, ISPs, TSPs, and supply chain, they are sort of one virtual supply chain of providers and sellers and resellers. So as much as you want to ingratiate yourself to government, you have to, it's important to understand you have to go in with partners, and you have to be shown to be able to play nicely with others, be a team player, understand that ecosystem, both your competitors and potential partners, and actually be able to partner up with your competitors in sort of co-opetition for things. So you have to be a known entity within that larger ecosystem. Especially in this space, going in it alone and trying to sell directly to the government without being known to anyone else within that environment is tough, because people are going to make calls and understand where you're coming from. However, if you go in as a known entity, people in the ecosystem and the market understand where you're coming from. They know, and they can vouch for you. It makes the sale a lot easier.
Yeah, so Dave, that's a good point. So maybe Jamie, this is, I think, very valid, and certainly your background, where this notion of the public sector and the private sector, they sort of overlap, and there's obviously some type of common interest. Here I'm thinking more like critical infrastructure, where I think 80% in Canada is in the private sector, and then what you have is about 20% in the public sector, but then there's a lot of overlap that takes place. Jamie, what's your thinking about some ideas of strategies of taking what one company is doing in the private sector, and sometimes if it's new to the government sector, showing some of that commonality, one could say?
Yeah, well, let me use an example that's very top of mind for me. I just flew home from the United States a few days ago, and of course, I had to fill out the ArriveCan app to come home, the infamous ArriveCan app. I'm sure many of you have used it. The reason I bring up ArriveCan is that it was developed by five relatively small private companies. Again, when the COVID restrictions came in, and in all five cases, the government purchased their services without tender. They were sole source contracts, five different developers to come up with the ArriveCan app that we now all know and love when we come home from abroad. That's actually a good example of when interests can align, because during a crisis like COVID, the government, which is usually slower and more ponderous and so on, suddenly had an urgent need. And they turned to five companies they already knew on a sole source contract, which is very rare, to meet that urgent need. And so you might be sitting there thinking, well, we could have done that. They didn't come to us. Well, you're right. And you know whose problem that is? That's yours, because they didn't know you. And it's your job to get known by the government when you have a supply or a service that you think the government could use. So good for all those five companies. Maybe they're good coders, maybe they're not. That's not the point. They were good at being known to their own government when the moment came that that service was needed. And there was an alignment of interest because both the private sector and the government had a need to move fast. I know that's a unusual, and hopefully continues to be an unusual set of circumstances. But to be more specific about Goran's question, the world is a lot more complicated than we think, both the government sector and the private sector. You have to answer to your investors, your shareholders. And that used to be it, by the way, in the private sector. It was Milton Friedman taught us all you have to do is answer to your shareholders. Now, of course, we also answer to our employees and to our regulators and to the communities that we operate in. Your job's become more complicated. I've had a foot in both worlds as the CEO of a bank and in the government world in both elected and unelected positions. And I can tell you, government is way more complicated. This whole idea of having to manage the public interest or interest management times 10. So I think we got to give a little respect to our government leaders who have to keep the public interest in mind. So it's a big interest. So you draw a circle of your interests and a bigger circle of government interests, and where they intersect, that's where you interact with the government. And if you do that, you'll be successful.
Yeah, that segues into question 5, actually, because I think you just hit again on a few other interesting points here. So Jamie, while I have you, we sometimes deal with these issues on an ongoing basis here at the firm, and that is, for question 5, I think the last question is, the government is increasingly being seen as a source of innovation promotion and R&D funding, particularly in the tech sector. What role do you see government relations firms like ours playing in identifying government funding opportunities?
Yeah. Well, this is Canada, right? This is Canada. So government's not just a customer. Government is a source of capital, particularly early stages. Provincial government and federal government. There's been all kinds of work done to identify where there are holes in the capital structure across the country, particularly early stage, mezzanine financing, Series A, Series B. Where are the holes? Venture capitalists. And government does step in. Government has the ability to take risks at early stages that most private investors won't take. That's why we have the Strategic Infrastructure Fund of government that places money in high bet situations, high risk situations, strategic investment fund, I should call it, that places money in high-risk companies where there's not really much of a hope of return, but 1 in 10 is a home run, and that's good for the country. I'm in Halifax. The Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency has the Jobs and Growth Fund, which places bets with small companies and larger companies that have a good idea, but that a private investor won't take the risk. So when you're building your company, I think it's important that you look at government both as a customer and as a source of capital. Often it's interest-free loans or forgivable debt. That doesn't mean it's cheap, by the way. Government capital can be expensive because of the public reporting requirements that go with it, but it's there to be had, particularly for the tech sector. And I'll give you one more example. I mentioned NATO a moment ago. Canada's a big member of the NATO alliance. NATO has started its own private equity fund called Diana. And the purpose of that fund is to place bets with tech companies in 7 key areas that they see as disruptive to the future of defense. They know they're not going to get a big ROI on the money, but they want to seed great ideas that are important to the. So the NATO interest is the defense of Canada and our alliance partners. And your interest is in developing good tech. Some of that fits with NATO's priorities, and Diana is a place where that can intersect. So firms like ours, we bring you together.
Yeah, and I just want to make that point, Jamie, that the Defense Initiative North Atlantic is basically the Diana program, as it's called, at NATO, is a €1 billion fund. And it acts a little bit like venture capital, and I think it's early stages in terms of solution development. So that's something that is very new, and it's still evolving. The details of that are still forthcoming by the federal government. But yeah, there is a trend now, as you suggested, to merge this notion of innovation promotion, R&D, and actually bring capital to the table at the critical early stage of getting the idea off the ground and hopefully trialed and fielded. And I do believe in the NATO case, available to all NATO members, all 32 NATO members, if that is the case. I want to just ask Dave. I know, Dave, you've been very successful at helping clients on the funding side obtain, obviously, funding resources from the government. I believe the IDEAS program and others. Can you just perhaps walk us through some of both the challenges and the opportunities that applying for such funding entails? Dave?
Yeah, for sure. I guess a couple points. One is, understanding, the paperwork process and the types of funding that are out there, and navigating it can be a little bit daunting. The language and the format and the paperwork required to submit some of these things. Behind the scenes, also understanding your client, speaking the right language, hitting the right key terms that speak to what their requirements are in the back end. So when they review the requirements, it's not just a technical response, but it does speak to some of the policy triggers and the strategy and the requirements behind the scenes. So understanding your client, and then most importantly is you may get past the first line where you're doing a little bit of innovation, but typically the way these things work is they're sort of rolling up. They add a little bit of innovation money, you get to a second stage, and then it's bigger, more innovation money, then more innovation money, eventually to a point where they're going to capitalize it, productize it, and field it. And that's where you want to be. In order to get there, and the biggest challenge I see with a lot of folks in the innovation space is it's fire and forget. They get their contract. They go off and do their research and provide some innovation. They don't have a single conversation with operational elements after that. So it never goes past the first stage and never gets developed. And so what typically one does if you want to be successful is you have to have an ongoing weekly dialogue, at least daily dialogue, with the operational elements, the end clients in this process, as well as your technical authorities and your research chairs and your sponsors. And you have to be able to think about long-term, how you're going to move this down the chain to increasingly larger investment by the government as they get comfortable fielding this. And then it's going to one has to be very sensitive to how you turn let's say fundamental research into something, let's say a technology level 1 and a solution level 1 to a technology level 9. where it's actually into the field. And then you're into the point where now you're providing a fielded system that is supported on an ongoing basis year after year after year. And that's sort of where you eventually want to be in this space. So yeah, so that I think that's part of the success of going through this innovation process with the government.
Yeah, well, David, I think thank you for that explanation, because I think it's important. I want to link it back to why government relations is actually important and matters to companies, because it allows the opportunity for the company to tell its own story and define its own reality, and in its own words talk about what is it that it can perform or do with the government. Sometimes, of course, if government officials do research on their websites or look at reports, annual reports, or other types of social media, the government itself is constructing its own impression of a particular tech company. And of course, not a lot of information is sometimes available on websites that companies use. So I think that this notion, as we've done in terms of client campaigns, is to take some of that secret sauce, convert it into government speak, and then maybe even graphically represent how that sort of integrates or can support a government network or be part of that ecosystem. So, and then of course there's the funding elements in terms of making sure that everything is proper and that you do maintain relationships over the course of that particular funding opportunity and beyond, because sometimes you do have that chance to sell to other government organizations through that contracting vehicle. So I just want to say that this has been an excellent conversation. I think all 5 questions, I think we explored up and down and sideways. So what I like to do now is I like to explore other topics that some of our audience members are putting and submitting. And I've got another sheet that I'm going to take a look at on our screen here as I'm being fed some interesting questions from the audience. So one question I have, and feel free either of you to jump in here, can you give us an example of a successful government relations campaign as it pertains to a tech company entering the market, let's say?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are numerous companies that have done very well entering the market. I'll use, I'm not going to name the company, but I will use a healthcare company here in Nova Scotia, a homegrown company that over the process of a number of years was able to show the Department of Health here in Nova Scotia their ability to run hospitals much more efficiently. And I think they did that by convincing the hospital administrators, who are always under great pressure with their budgets and leery about an investment now that doesn't pay off for years in the future, that they would get a quick and ongoing return on a relatively small investment. So this is a great example, actually, of how, in business we talk about ROI and IRR and borrowing capacity and cap tables. And in government, really, that's not their language. They certainly have business objectives. They talk about budgetary pressures and budget room and borrowing requirements and all those things. And if you're able to convert your language into their language in a way that works for government, then you can be successful. And I use healthcare specifically because even if you haven't read all the departmental business plans and mandate letters and platforms, you've got to know that the delivery of healthcare in Canada as a public good is under tremendous pressure. And if you have an app, a product, a service, a piece of software that can help, they're going to want to talk to you. And that's a great place to build that trusting relationship that results in working together and in a sale.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on that, Jamie, in our Q&A session now. So the general question is about successful campaigns, and that's a hard one because it depends on how a company actually enters the market. They may have been here for years and nobody perhaps heard of them, or they may be perhaps brand new into the marketplace and are looking to create that brand awareness, reputation enhancement, etc. So I think that in terms of the question, give examples, I think there's so many different types of examples, but the most successful campaign, in my opinion, is the one that I guess aligns with what are the business objectives of a company and what are the business development strategies toward moving that particular solution into the government together with government relations. It's a factor because another question I have here that somebody submitted to us, and that is, in terms of working in let's say an SME tech company, that one of the questions we have here, is it worth to use the services of GR firms like Samuel Associates to help introduce and sell services to the government? I'll just preface that by saying absolutely, because for all the reasons that we've been talking for the last while, it really comes down to reputation, credibility, and ultimately trust. And I think all those three factors were aligned. But Dave, I'll ask you the question here. Obviously, SMEs, they have a tight budget, but using GR firms to help them or assist them in the process. Can you give us your thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it makes a lot of sense too, is if you've done your homework, beforehand, that you understand, you have somewhat of a business plan and you understand where you're going. And because the first thing is one going to ask are those sorts of things. On behalf of, before you approach the government, it's really around red teaming, those sorts of questions. And if you don't have any of that, to expect that that's going to be part of the process. Is, have you done a SWOT? What's your competitive profile like? How do you describe your product? You describe it in a way that makes sense. How are you different? How do you stand out? Do you have partners? How are we going to go about this? To one of the original questions, one example of a very successful campaign, without naming names, was putting together a conference that on a particular subject matter with interesting speakers, have some high-tech SMBs there to show what they're going to do, have some government partners that are already, our sponsors already on board that endorse the technology in principle, to gain that sort of visibility, and then be able to match up, let's say, a small SMB with say a large existing provider of tech services that has a contract vehicle that's willing to white label the product, and then matching up contract vehicles, money, trust, supply chain conduit, things like this, but also wrapping it around a particular subject that's of interest to the government. Like, one could be, I'm making this up top of my mind, could be remote secure communications around the pandemic. It's top of mind. Okay, how do we do that? Well, let's put together, some very interesting, SMBs in Canada that have very good solutions to this, but maybe particularly unknown, and then put the right people together in the right room to hear those sorts of things, and maybe bring in, innovation funding folks into the same room as well. Sort of one-stop shopping, and hopefully, something is going to click. And in fact, in the past, I've seen SMBs go from zero to hero in that sort of environment, where they're able to show what they have, and there's a clear path to how that's going to be able to procure in a trusted sort of fashion.
So, just what I take away from what you just said, Dave, is that, yeah, having a government relations firm as part, I guess, of to some extent, the management team that is pursuing this opportunity, it's really about trying to look at all of the variables. If a company does not have a kind of line of sight awareness as to what is happening in a department, and of course, any government department or agency is turning over its leadership from time to time, rotational 2-3 year cycles. So people that perhaps you saw a few years ago may have actually now moved on to other assignments or promoted or left government. And so that sort of investment in being aware of who is, your point of contact, and of course, who do you need to meet on a regular basis or on an annual basis? In some cases, we often advise CEOs, for example, that they should meet with the minister or a deputy minister or definitely an assistant deputy minister at least once a year in terms of trying to just make sure that they maintain some form of communication and visibility into the department at a very high level. But at the same time, I've seen, Jamie, I know we worked on a variety of different topics and files for clients. Can you talk a little bit about, how do you work from the middle up in terms of communicating an offering or a message from a tech company to a government agency?
Yeah, to that I would say there's a reason we call them government relations campaigns. Just like a political campaign or a military campaign, we put together GR campaigns for our clients. And I think that wording is very interesting because just like with other kinds of campaigns, you need a clear objective, you need crystal clear and concise communications, and you need really a plan of attack. This government of Canada is a massive entity. And so how do you approach it in an efficient way? That takes years of expertise to figure out because there's going to be multiple points of contact, there's going to be multiple fronts, and over a period of time, that's a campaign. And so we run campaigns for our clients. The second point I'll make on that, and I say this to our clients all the time, you can, even as a small company, do your own GR. You can start from scratch and study the government and all the players and all the objectives and start to have meetings, and you'll make some mistakes. You'll get directed to the right person and you'll be directed to another person. It'll take you 5 to 10 years to get to a point where that trusting relationship exists where sales can occur. GR firms exist to accelerate that process. We're in that government marketplace 24/7. We already have all that. You rent it from us. So your 5 to 10 year plan, you can think for yourself how much it would cost in time and resources and money to run that plan. Or you can do a very accelerated version by renting from us the existing trusting relationship. You borrow our trusting relationship, basically, for a period of time to meet your government objectives. That's what GR firms like ours do.
That's a good question because one of the other participants sent the message in terms of the comment section that says, given that there's so many different government departments and agencies, how do you know who the right person is to contact to introduce your company and obviously provide some type of a solution presentation? I think that's a big question, but maybe I can ask Dave that to sort of, you've been in different parts of government, both as a federal employee, as a contractor, and certainly in the private sector. I mean, Dave, how do you find the right person in government when it comes to a specific set of solutions? Do you have any suggestions that you can provide our audience?
Yeah, I mean, the team that you've assembled, is really quite spectacular in the sense of their ability to having come from government at executive levels and worked up through the government in a lot of cases. So, I mean, in terms of just understanding who's who in the environment is important. Save you a lot of time. From my particular area in terms of high tech cyber, I've been working with the government for 20, 30 years. It pretty much is known who's doing what, within each department. And we keep those things fairly up to date, minute, day to day. In some cases, if we don't know the person directly, it usually takes 1 or 2 calls to get down to the right person. And part of it's also understanding the right questions to ask, understanding how the system works and where the right person would sit. And again, what their authorities, responsibilities, and accountabilities are, where the money sits. Again, may not be with the same person. You may have to talk to a bunch of different people. So part of the GR firm's job is to orchestrate that. It's very rare you're going to find one person in the government that has all the authority, that understands the requirements, and has all the budget and has a supply arrangement and contract vehicle. It's not going to happen. Even executive level. It's pulling together multiple different people at different levels, from an executive to operational level, across the organization. And it's not a huge amount normally. Like if it's specifically you're looking at selling, quantum cryptography, it's going to be a very small list. If you're selling, something else, is going to be a small list. So it's going to save you a lot of time in terms of narrowing down from the entire directory of folks that have very ambiguous names and titles down to the few that really need to talk to.
Yes, but that's a valid point, because one of the questions that we have, Dave, is, what is the government's projected 2023 requirements? What could they be? What might they be? Where's some of that opportunity perhaps in the 2023 year and beyond? I just wanted to say that in some cases, when you do have a solution that is not an obvious owner in a particular department, sometimes clients have contracted us to try to figure that out and try to, with the government, convene interdepartmental working group to examine something and ultimately try to find who could perhaps take the champion or the lead role in an area where sometimes it's not clear. And the newest technology, yes, might be clear, but then the question ultimately is, who wants to own this going forward? And sometimes some of those conversations might be early within the government community itself. But I'm going to just ask you, Dave, what do you see the priorities for 2023 and beyond are as the government sort of, pivots in a post-COVID environment? I know some of our questions that are coming in are kind of alluding to some kind of forecasting that you might perhaps talk about.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because we see a lot of policy statements and larger strategies coming out, as well as what we read about in the news or know about in technology in terms of trending technologies and disruptive technologies. And then we see what comes out of procurement, buy and sell. And sometimes they just don't match, just because it's, especially government processes, it's a long drawn out process. So what's here and now in the news cycle may not be what's coming out in buy and sell. So you can't, one hand, you could sit back and you can just answer RFPs, but you're going to be behind the 8 ball. You're not going to be able to shape the environment. And in some cases, you're not going to be able to sell whatever latest technology you have. So you need to get ahead of that. And somewhere in there, you need to start to talk to the government about new technologies, state of the art, what's the art of the possible, and then start to shape what comes out in the near term. Now, obviously, especially post-pandemic, we've experienced anything to do with rapid digitalization of the workplace, going to remote communications, cloud-based. Almost anything that you're going to sell will have to be even if it's partly on-prem, we'll have to have some sort of cloud instance or ability to provide software as a service, infrastructure as a service. Almost everything is coming out that way. So that's one of the first questions you'll be asked. Well, can your software or hardware be put in the cloud? And the question there is, do you have a cloud provider? Have you tried it already? Are you already cloud ready? Next question, is it secure? How do we know it's secure? As you've taken care of privacy and considerations? How are you going to support that? How you can support it remotely? How can you scale? So these are pretty basic questions that are coming out over and over again in RFPs that I'm working on one right now. It's always going to be put in there. So these are pretty standard sort of questions. And then if you look at the trending technologies, everything from AI, machine learning, expert systems, 5G, compatibility, miniaturization. From a technological point of view, these are most likely buzzwords that are going to be in RFPs, technical RFPs that are coming out and are top of mind of people in the government.
I can take a crack at that for a second.
Go ahead, Jamie.
I want to answer that in just a little bit of a different way. I think the government's been very clear on the priorities for the remainder of its mandate and probably beyond, no matter who the government is. Climate change, giant priority of the government of Canada. It's going to be all our priorities for the rest of our lives. Technology that helps mitigate the effects of climate change. It's going to be at the top of the heap. Think of companies like Carbon Cure in Dartmouth, which takes carbon out of the atmosphere and injects it into concrete for construction. Companies in that area are going to do very, very well with their governments. Indigenous relations in Canada, high priority for the current government, going to be a priority for a long time. Just want to share with everybody that the Trudeau government made it very clear they have a goal that at least 5% of government purchasing across all of government will come from Indigenous businesses. Samuel Associates has aligned with the First Nations community, and you might want to do the same, because 5% of a very big number is still a very big number. That's another one. I mentioned northern security. Canada shares a border with Russia. Our north is largely underpopulated and undefended, and that needs to be addressed. So defense spending is going to go way up. The government is going to be looking for people to help it meet our domestic defense needs and our commitments to the NATO alliance, which, as you know from the news, is doing its best to support Ukraine in its war with Russia. And then at the provincial level, it's all about healthcare all the time. Anyone that has anything to contribute to the delivery of more efficient healthcare is going to do very well. And the context for all of that is that we all ran up our debts really, really high during COVID, and the government does not have the capital and knows it doesn't have all the ideas to address those gigantic problems. And they'll be looking to companies large and small with good ideas and access to private capital in the private sector to help them meet their objectives. That is the heart of government relations.
Well, thank you. It's very comprehensive, Jamie and Dave. Thank you for your insights. We have a few more minutes. I just wanted to wrap up and ask you, Jamie, if you have any questions you want to ask Dave, or Dave, if you have any questions you want to ask Jamie, or you can target any questions at me as the host of the event today. So we have about 4 minutes, and it's rapid fire.
Well, sure. I would, Dave. In your view, is military procurement different than general government procurement? And if so, how is it different? And what should our audience know about the difference between selling military and then selling to government overall?
Oh, yeah, great question. I think it's different in the sense that typical military procurement is being like large ticket items, ships, aircraft, tanks, and so that by and large the system is set up for that sort of thing. Now that's not exclusive. I mean, they buy a lot of IT, but by and large, what they're trying to do is what you'll find more in Department of National Defense, from my estimation, is they like to work with big players that then manage a supply chain of thousands of SMBs. So more than other sectors, it's important to have big partners and play nicely in that ecosystem, because you may not be able to sell directly, but you may be able to sell indirectly your products through multiple different larger players in large scale programs. So that's changing slightly, but not the same speed of, let's say, a department that buys a lot of small ticket items instead of like one or two big ones. So D&D has, famously will have like billion-dollar programs that are running over 30 years. So I think that's primarily the biggest differences, and where you go with that is the partnering option.
Dave, do you have any questions for Jamie or me?
Wow. I mean, some of the questions are sort of the people have already posed in terms of some of the obviously benefits in that. I would say, I guess from the point of which sort of insight that you would have or be able to bring to SMBs that want to break into the market, just from the talent that, let's say, you have in the company, and what sort of access and experience, collective experience that you may have that may save an SMB time in terms of trying to navigate that environment.
That's a good question. I'll take this one because we have about over 25 professionals in terms of on the defense and national security side. I mean, we cover Army, Air Force, Navy, cyber, space, and national security. So we have folks that have had 30, 40 years of experience, some in uniform, some in the corporate sector, some in politics and industry and academia. So it's that type of long experience that's required. I do agree that the system does not change that much. And so folks who've been there for 30, 40 years, know how the system looks like, but I think what changes is the people inside and sometimes the priorities. And so here at Samuel Associates, I mean, we have a excellent roster of experts on a variety of topics, including the tech sector as well, because as Jamie was asking you earlier, there's a lot of the defense and national security project, but also there's other parts of government as well that require high-tech solutions. So thank you for asking that question. I'll just finish off by saying thank you, because we're just running out of time now. This has been an excellent webinar, and I want to thank Jamie in Halifax for his time today. And Dave, you're just outside of Ottawa here. I want to thank you for taking the time today. That concludes our LinkedIn Live webinar. I would like to, of course, express my gratitude to the audience, and I would like to invite you to continue with the discussion through the social media pages that we will have displayed shortly. And if you want to get in touch with us, feel free to do so on LinkedIn or our website. And if you're interested in today's topic and your company is interested in government relations and how that might be able to support your efforts in helping to win business, but also to communicate with government, feel free to schedule a call here with us at Samuel Associates. You can connect directly on LinkedIn, or I can be reached on our website. And again, I look forward to seeing you on another occasion. Thank you and have a good day.